It started with helmets and money. Then came the drones and ATGMs. Then artillery and now Western main battle tanks. The war in Ukraine is escalating. Step by step, we come closer to the edge. The Russians are in their second wave of mobilization. Soon, there will be another offensive. Kiev is now asking for F-16 jets. The situation is clearly spinning out of control. And the most important thing, it's happening not fast enough that people are alarmed. Don't sleep on this. We are slowly completing the checklist for a worst-case scenario. But why are the Western tanks such a concern for many experts? And what will happen next in the war? If we stay on our current trajectory, how long do we have until the war in Ukraine becomes a world war? Welcome to Dark New World. 1 year after the start of the Ukraine war, the situation changed dramatically to the one we had in the beginning phases of the Russian invasion. While in the beginning there were long discussions about the delivery of 5,000 helmets, as in Germany, battle tanks are now being sent to the front. Western supplies of arms have gradually increased in volume and quality, and Europe is increasingly becoming an active party in the conflict. Step by step, the situation is escalating. In the beginning, NATO generals believed that Ukraine would fall within days. No one in the West believed that Ukraine would have a chance. The media supported that narrative. But the Russians miscalculated the situation, and soon the reports paint a picture of incompetent Russians and winning Ukrainians. So let me get straight to the point. Ukraine is losing. And the Ukrainian military has some problems that they cannot fix easily, if they can fix them at all. While we get reports from the front lines in the media, we only see bits and pieces of a much bigger and complex picture. To understand the situation, we have to look at the basics and remind ourselves who is fighting here. Ukraine has a population of around 44 million people. Russia is more than 3 times bigger in that regard, with around 140 million people. The war in Ukraine is a conventional war in a vast territory. The front line in Ukraine is almost 2,500 kilometers long. Most people will compare this war to wars in the Middle East, but the nature of those conflicts couldn't be more different. This is all-out warfare. And for a war in this category, you need millions of soldiers to fight, conquer and control territory in Ukraine's flat terrain. This was one of the big miscalculations the Russian military made in the beginning of the invasion. Of the 40 million people living in Ukraine, not all are capable to fight in combat. Also, millions have already fled the country or are killed in combat or due to bombing. The biggest problem Volodymyr Zelensky faces is a lack of manpower to fight against the Russians. If you noticed, Western media always tries to inform about the Russian losses, while ignoring the Ukrainian side. Experts, analysts and most important of all, volunteers fighting on the ground say that Ukrainian losses are even higher than the ones on the Russian side. With a second wave of mobilization coming, Russia will have more than 1 million soldiers actively working in Ukraine or back in Russia to help Russian war efforts. The situation is worsening for Ukraine with every day, because Russia is simply trying to grind down the Ukrainian army until it collapses. And time is on the Russian side. The next problem is the lack of remaining heavy weapons such as main battle tanks in the Ukrainian armed forces. At the start of the war, Ukraine had around 800 tanks, with 1,000 additional in storage. The fact that Ukraine urged Poland and the Czech Republic to send their stock of old Soviet T-72s immediately to Ukraine in May 2022 suggests that a large portion of Ukraine's tank fleet got destroyed in the beginning. On the other hand, Russia has a large stockpile of old Soviet-era tanks that it can rely on. Many people will now point out that Ukraine could capture a lot of Russian tanks in their offensive operations. But here it's important to acknowledge that these tanks are probably not in good condition or completely useless and destroyed. Only a small portion of the captured tanks could be incorporated into the Ukrainian forces or used for spare parts. Now we come to the point where European stocks of old Soviet-era tanks are depleted, and Ukraine is forced to change to Western main battle tanks. This is another hint that Ukraine is running low on armored vehicles and equipment in general. So, European countries and the US will send Ukraine Western-made battle tanks. Mostly the Leopard 2, from A4 models from the 1980s to the more modern A6 models from the early 2000s. In total, Ukraine could expect between 200 and 300 tanks in the coming months. In Western media, the main battle tanks are portrayed as a game changer. It suggested that Ukraine could spearhead a new offensive in spring with these tanks. In general, like with HIMARS before, the hype around this weapon system has nothing to do with the strategic situation on the ground in Ukraine. The current sensationalism on tanks, as with Javelin drones and HIMARS in the past months, derives from two interconnected dynamics. The first is an incomplete portrayal of the war from a constant but incomplete flow of information emerging from the front lines, which has overemphasized the role of individual weapons. Events on the battlefield are a product of complex interplay between political, economic and technological processes, the understanding of which requires a willingness to reconsider and revise initial analytical assumptions as more evidence emerges over time. War, therefore, cannot be reduced to the role of single weapon systems, whose impact is just a drop in an ocean of intertwined factors. The second, more dangerous dynamic is the tendency, especially in the conventional debate, to consider war as a linear, monolithic phenomenon that is now easily predictable thanks to an unprecedented flow of information and open source intelligence. As such, against the backdrop of Russia's overall poor military performance and an imminent huge delivery of heavy equipment to Ukraine, it now seems consequential to assume Russia's inevitable defeats in the face of qualitatively superior tanks. But such assumptions are very dangerous, for they encourage underestimation of the adversary's strength and limit our understanding of the conflict's different phases. While Russia is having enormous problems, it is also adapting and preparing for a protracted conflict. Now the question remains, what will happen next in the war? Well, there are some signs that could suggest that Russia will attack from Belarus again, after the first attempt to capture Kiev failed. Russia has several field hospitals in Belarus now, which is an indicator. Field hospitals are not necessary for training exercises, and could indicate preparation for combat operations. The appearance of field hospitals in Belarus in early 2022 was among the final indicators observed before Russia commenced its full-scale invasion. On the other hand, Russia has not yet formed strike groups, and the numbers needed for an offensive are not met yet. Russia could try to divert Ukrainian forces from the southeast by setting up a feint in Belarus, and military activity in Belarus could be an element of a disinformation campaign. Whatever the reality is, we will soon find out how the next phase of the war will play out. Spring means that both sides have to take action. The problem is, the scale of the war is increasing. NATO gets more and more involved in a direct matter, and the danger of a direct confrontation is overlooked by many in the West. Normalcy bias is our biggest enemy right now. While everyone was shocked that there is a war 1 year ago, people don't really care about a situation like they did before. But let me repeat that again. The war is spiraling out of control, and I may be overdramatic for some of my viewers, but I am not fear-mongering at all when I say that we are on the path to World War III. In fact, everything that happened in the past 12 months were tiny steps of escalation. Because every step was small, people didn't fall into panic. But if you look at the past 12 months from afar, the picture is horrifying. And the debates about the tanks that we saw in the West were not real. They had the task to get the people used to the fact that it will happen. Now, and this is my tinfoil hat theory, and take it with a giant grain of salt, but I think that Ukrainian tankers were trained in Leopard 2s for months now. I think the decision was made long ago, and what we see, for example in Germany, was just for the public. But again, this is just my own personal theory. Who knows? Russia and Ukraine view this conflict as existential and are fully preparing for a drawn-out war that will ultimately be settled on the battlefield. Neither side has a political incentive to compromise at this time, which was made explicitly clear in recent days by the leaders of both nations. Putin reiterated that Russia's campaign will continue until all objectives have been achieved, while Zelensky vowed to reclaim all annexed territory, including Crimea. With hundreds of thousands of Russian forces ready to enter the arena, and the prospect of new axes of invasion opening up, the war's trajectory is heading for certain escalation. We don't have many red lines left to cross before NATO is directly involved in the war. And while many are continuing with their lives, I want to remind you that hundreds of thousands of people die in Eastern Europe. And now, German tanks are fighting again on Ukrainian soil against the Russian army. Both Russia and Ukraine will have a hard time to survive. Not because of the war and sanctions, but demographics. This war is just additional oil to feed the flames. If a nuke goes off, then it could mean the end for most of us. And like many don't believe in climate change, or the fact that Russia could invade, or that the stock market could crash in 2008, it will be an unpopular opinion until the air sirens start to scream in Western Europe and the US. If you have any questions about the war in Ukraine, climate change, or anything else related to this channel, then write them down in the comments below. I will pick some of them and answer them in a future video. If you want to support me and help me grow, then please like the video and subscribe in case you're not. You can also support me on Patreon if you want, but watching my videos till the end would make me happy as well. If you want to know more about the nuclear arsenal of Russia, then watch this video. And if you want to know more about food shortages, then this video is for you. My name is Dennis, thank you for watching and goodbye.